And it sounds like we're doing an exercise.
Yeah.
That would be. All right.
All right, welcome everybody to live Q&A. This is Pastor and the Recovering Heretic. We have returned. I am Pastor Dave, and with me is Recovering Heretic Dan.
Yes. Fully recovered and ready to pummel you with questions.
I feel like we need to come up with like a Oh Danny Boy cover for like Oh Heretic Dan. The heresies are calling.
That is very appropriate.
Yeah,
I kind of like that.
It could work, I think.
Yeah.
You know, I'd have to work on the lyrics a little bit more, but it could
Right.
work.
Yeah, we'll work on a full set. That'll be good.
Yeah.
That'll be good.
All right.
Okay, so today's gospel reading was about our buddy John the Baptist.
Yep.
And there just seemed to be a lot of inconsistencies, contradictions, stuff that just doesn't make sense from how a human would be, much less what the Bible says to do.
Yeah.
So I wanted to spend most of our time exploring that.
Yeah.
And so let's just launch into it. Just a reminder for people who might, be watching this after.
We had an audience pre-question,
Yeah.
so why don't we start with that question?
Well,
first?
yeah.
So,
I want to. Let us go ahead and start with that.
Okay.
That was going to be question 3, but Karen is chomping at the bit because
Yeah.
she had this question. Why did John say that Herod's marrying of his brother's wife was wrong? Because I think it's in Genesis, they basically talk about, no, you are supposed to
yeah.
marry your brother's widow. Your
Widow.
brother's widow.
Right. So that's the key. Widow. Herod's brother is very much still alive.
Ah, there you go, Karen. There's the
So-
distinction.
So it's that Herod, or I forget which, I think it's Archelaus, one of them divorced. This Herod managed to get Herodias to divorce her husband, and then he married her. So he's still very much alive,
Okay.
you know.
Okay.
And the Herod family they kind of like trade their women in marriage and remarry frequently, which is partially why Jesus gives that strong condemnation against remarriage, divorce and remarriage. You know, it's
Okay.
because the Herod family is known for doing this, marrying somebody and then saying, oh, I got a better deal with this person than,
So I'm getting rid of you. They were like baseball trading cards.
yes. So, yes, right. Which is bad, you know,
Yeah.
that's why John's having an issue with it. So,
Okay.
yeah. So you're correct. In leave-right marriage, it's called, if you're a widow, then there was an expectation for the brother to marry so that you're cared for. But in this circumstance, the brother is still very much alive.
So wasn't it a combination of caring for the widow, because obviously they didn't have social safety nets back then,
Right.
but also wasn't there this aspect of legacy? Like when it was the rule originally came about, there wasn't really much of a belief in an afterlife. So if your brother's legacy was going to live on, you kind of became the proxy for that.
Yes, there is that too, where it's allowing, your progeny to continue and your line to continue, which is, there was an attitude that, right, like God's promises to Israel were like very tangible, they were land, and like specifically like this parcel of land was yours, and so to the point where like the Old Testament actually describes how like the permanent buying and selling of the land is forbidden because you could enter into long-term leasing arrangements, but it was always yours because God had given it to you. It wasn't yours to buy or sell.
Yeah.
And so there's this attitude that they had, which is for God's promises to continue, there have to be progeny to continue that promise, because his promise is this very tangible thing
Yeah.
to our people, this land parceled out here.
So there would be no real estate industry
They
in
got
this
around
era.
it by basically what are like long-term leasing arrangements, but technically there weren't like land transfer deeds, Now they violated this rule all the time, which is one of the prophet's major objections. This is what Amos is ranting against in our first, one of the many things Amos is ranting against in our first lesson, is that they're violating this sense of the land as promise.
Is that, and I know we're straying a little bit from John, we'll get back to him, but in light of current events, with what's going on in Gaza, with, the border with Lebanon, and, recent legalization of new settlements taking over the land there, is that part of why Israel is so big on land acquisition, that they want to go back to the biblical border because that was given by God? Is that what's the background?
Yeah, I mean, for a certain, so it's hard in Israel because don't confuse modern day Israel with the kingdom of Israel. They're two different things, right? The modern state of Israel is different, So I guess I would say there are some in Israel for whom, yes, that is their motivation. They usually tend toward the most conservative religious parties, And then there are a variety of other motivations in a very big conflict that exist all at once, right? Because again, not all Jews are religious. There's a lot of Jews that are secular, and some of them are just as land acquisition happy as the religious ones, And so that is the motivation for some. I would be careful in ascribing that motivation to everybody in Israel or the state itself, which has its own. The state's concerns are often not religious; they are security-minded,
Yeah. Well, I know, Gaza, for example. That's
Right.
what's
Right. So that's a different motivation than the religious impetus,
that. And just for comparison purposes, what, from a landmass standpoint, what is the current state of Israel as far as borders go compared to the kingdom of Israel that we read about in the Bible? Is the modern state larger, smaller, roughly the same? And I would assume you'd have to combine Israel and Judea.
It depends on which part of the Bible you're reading and at what time, right? So like the book of Genesis describes the promise as everything from the Nile River up to the Euphrates. So like that's actually a vast, covers Egypt, Sinai, Syria, and parts of Iraq. That's a vast Jordan, like that's a vast area. So like that's kind of the promise as described to Abraham. If you read Joshua, Judges, First and maybe part of 2 Samuel, or into parts of 1 Samuel, you get a strip of territory which is kind of what's called the Central Highlands, which is this stretch of hilly area kind of in the center of modern day Israel, Palestine, that is their territory. And then David's kingdom, sort of roughly analogous to modern day borders, there's including Palestine, like the West Bank, Solomon's kingdom is more expansive than that into Syria, and then it's divided and gets smaller after that. So depends on, are you reading about Genesis and the vast promise God gives, or are you reading about Joshua, Judges, Joshua and Judges, where it's this Central Highland Confederacy, or are you reading about the United Monarchy at its height, or the divided monarchy when it's much smaller? What time period in the map on the back of your Bible are describing?
So like a lot of life. There's a lot more nuance to this than.
Well, right. I mean, it's not like they just plopped, even in the scriptures, right? Like, it's not like they just plopped there and got everything. Judges describes a kind of loose, central, hilly, highland confederacy of tribes that kind of has control of its territory, but kind of doesn't, kind of like the Pashtun in Afghanistan, Pakistan area, like if a significant, if the Palestinian or if the Philistines with their army actually went out, they would beat them, but it'd be a heck of a thing to actually occupy and take the territory, and so nobody does.
Yeah.
So it's complicated. Which is different again than the than the united monarchy, which is different than the divided monarchy.
Which is different from the democracy, which
which is different than from when Babylon comes and Assyria comes, and reverse that order: Assyria, then Babylon, then Persia, then
Greece.
Right, then Greece, then there's the independent kingdom for a century, and then there's Rome, and so.
So just throw a dart at a time period and then decide.
Right, which is different from when which was up to the Eastern Roman Empire, and then it was the Arab conquests, and then it was the Ottoman conquests, and then it was British Mandate Palestine.
So there's never really been a steady.
Well, it's a heavily trafficked area. Let's put it that
Yeah.
way.
Who gets it this week, kind of thing. Well, let's pop back to John, and. You've mentioned before that John was probably an Essene.
He fits into that camp. He's apocalyptic. He eats strange foods. He's out in the wilderness. That's the area the Essenes were in, the kind of Jordan River Valley kind of thing. So that fits,
Yeah, I found strange foods they eat. I found a grasshopper in my garden, my vegetable garden this morning.
So see?
And there was this temptation to dip it in honey and see what John was talking
see
about.
what John was doing, right? Maybe he was onto something.
Yeah. Well, what's that? You mentioned that as a diet with the Essenes. Was that a regular diet? The Bible gives the impression that this was a form of asceticism for John.
It's not really about the Essenes. It's about the diet is meant to kind of harken back to the other prophets who have eaten out in the wilderness. Elijah is fed by the ravens, out in the wilderness. The people exist on, so it's supposed to be this, you're supposed to hear images of, like he's Elijah reborn is kind of what you're supposed to hear.
So it is supposed to echo back to that.
He's one of the prophets reborn,
Well, and speaking of reborn, I don't see Judaism or Christianity as big on reincarnation. So why would there be this thing of a prophet being reincarnated?
Yeah, it's not quite reincarnation. It's the spirit of Elijah, that same kind of, think of Elijah as a role that is played, less as the reincarnation of a person.
So it's a mantle kind of thing?
Yeah, the mantle. Well, literally it is, right? It passes on to Elisha. So like that, the last words in the Old Testament are, "Behold, my prophet Elijah shall come again." And that's supposed to herald the coming Messianic age. And so that's the last, in the Christian Old Testament, that's the last prophetic word spoken. And then there's this 400-year gap, if you don't include the Apocrypha, which we don't. But there's this.
So this is later that same millennia.
Yeah, well, all right. There's this 400-year thing where there is not a prophet in Israel, and that's why John's coming is so momentous. Is there hasn't been one of these. That's why everybody keeps saying, "Oh, he's a prophet of old." Like there hasn't been one of these in Israel in a while. God is finally speaking again. Is kind of the attitude.
So does Herod feel that way about him too? It mentions that Herod loves listening to him.
Yeah.
So does Herod also feel that he is a prophet reborn?
I think Herod is strangely intrigued by him. Yeah, right. Hedging his bet. I think it's the fourth Pirates of the Caribbean movie, the fourth or the fifth one. It's a bad movie, but the main bad guy in the movie is an undead pirate who has a priest tied to his pole, the mast of his ship the whole time, because the priest keeps trying to preach redemption to him. And I kind of think that's kind of what Herod's like. He's a bad guy, objectively, by every measure of the word, but he's vaguely interested in this prophet who just won't shut up and keeps trying. Is kind of how that's my characterization of it.
Well, we talk about John is portrayed as being out in the wilderness, right? And people come to him, they
Right.
get baptized in the Jordan, what have you. So did Herod go out to hear him, or was he like
Well,
often
here-
invited to the palace?
Well, here it describes he arrested him, and then in being arrested, he kept him from being executed.
And would have him come to court and prophesy? or-
Probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it was almost entertainment for the court at times?
Maybe, sort of. It says he's perplexed and confused, which he's intrigued, so quasi-entertainment, this is part of my sermon, but there's something to this, I know it, but I just can't do it, kind of thing, and that's how I would describe what Herod is doing.
So with Herod, here's what I'm trying to wrap my head around. I mean, obviously, to willy-nilly decide to execute somebody means you don't really value human life to begin with.
Well, yes, Herod is not a reputable man
Yeah.
in this regards. Yes.
But given his actual interest in John, it just seems extra, in the true sense of the term, extraordinarily flippant for him to go ahead and execute John because he was interested in the message, because he wanted to learn more about him, and then to go ahead and do that because of, for all intents and purposes, a bet.
Yeah, I mean, we don't take oaths all that often in our life, so this was a big deal to make an oath like this, to solemnly promise, I will do this, whatever you ask, right? You were inviting the wrath of the thingy high atop the whatever if you were not to keep your oath. And then there's a public relations thing also, which it sounds crazy to us, but just think of some of the controversies Joe Biden gets into, being embarrassed at court is a big deal, and so there's this aspect of he made an oath, which he shouldn't have made. That's why the Bible says don't make oaths.
Yeah.
So he made an oath, which he shouldn't have made. And this is why you shouldn't make it, because then you're kind of obligated by both the forces of religion, God,
And PR.
To keep it, and it was stupid of him. And yeah, on top of that, right, Herod's not known for being the most pro-life person imaginable, and so yes, he's going to say, well, yeah, sure, I'll kill him in order to keep the oath and not avoid the PR disaster.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued, but I'm not that intrigued.
Well, and just to clarify, you said that, it's why the Bible says not to make an oath. Is that what, somewhere vaguely in my memory, I don't remember who told me this, where I read it, but that's ultimately what the commandment to not take the Lord's name in vain really means.
It's partially about it, right? That's one of the things that's centered on meaning is don't use the Lord's name to promise something you're not going to promise. You're not going to do, don't swear by God.
Yeah. So technically, in the American judicial system, when they have you put your hand on the Bible and say, you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God, that's actually violating that commandment.
Well, if you don't do it,
So 90% of the time,
Right.
people are violating that
if
commandment.
you don't do it, Luther says in that commandment, God's name is supposed to be called on in times of distress. We're supposed to use God's name to call on it for prayer, praise, help, and thanksgiving. And it's and any other use of that name, of his name, is a misuse, is taking the Lord's name in vain. 'Cause we are actually given it in order to call on in times of distress and give praise to in times of blessing, and that's why we're given the name, is so that we may bless God and call on him for help, not so that we may make silly promises about beheading people.
Yeah. Well, what was John saying that would have intrigued someone like Herod? I mean, based on what you've described of him, like you said, not a very religious guy. So why pay
I
attention
have
to
found
John?
people in power are a little bit intrigued with the person who has enough courage to stand up and say, what you're doing is wrong. You know, like you encounter so many sycophants when you're in power that the person who kind of stands up and says, no, this is wrong, kind of intrigues them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's my impression is what it really was. And I think, technically they're followers of Judaism, so technically, it's been 400 years since a prophet. You might have a genuine, honest-to-God biblical prophet right here.
Someone to pay attention to.
Well, it's like, this is kind of cool. Like, look at this new little toy I have, just out of the box and everything,
Wow.
Complete with camel's hair, so it'd be kind of cool. Yeah, right. This is cool.
Well, you've mentioned in the past in some of our sessions that we actually have more historical record about John the Baptist
Yes.
than we do, obviously, about Jesus.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say that far. I would say Josephus spends some time on John the Baptist.
Okay. So what do we know about John? What was he preaching beyond what we use him for in the Christian, to
I forget.
foretell Jesus coming? What else was there?
Yeah, Josephus spends time on him talking about his religious movement. Josephus says he's arrested for anti-Herod preaching, not this incident. He doesn't really mention this. This is not what Josephus says he's arrested for. I don't think the two things are mutually exclusive.
So what is anti-Herod preaching? Because doesn't Herod legitimately hold the throne, or so
No.
why would he be anti-Herod? What would he be?
Herod the Great is not actually fully Jewish. He's half Arab. They're half Arab, half Jewish family who were not originally. So the Greek Empire this is the long history. The Greek Empire rules the Israel area for a while until Antiochus Epiphanes is his name, decides he wants to try and sacrifice a pig on the high altar in the temple in Jerusalem, which literally sets the whole country ablaze. They just they lose it. You know?
Yeah.
And they start a revolution and they win. We call this the Maccabean Revolution. This is the
Oh,
Maccabees.
okay.
Right, and so they win.
And the source of Hanukkah then.
Right, and source of Hanukkah, and so they win, and they actually get their independence for about 80 years. Pompey the Great then is doing a grand tour around the Mediterranean, kind of conquering everything in his way.
This is the same Pompey with Julius Caesar.
Yes,
and,
that
okay.
Pompey. This is how Pompey made his name.
Okay.
How he made his name and fortune is he did this grand seaside cruise where he just conquered kingdoms along the coast of the Mediterranean as he went, and so one of the places he stops in after conquering Syria is.
I love how you make it sound like it's a Taylor Swift tour.
That's what it was, basically. He was just like, I'm just here, let's go,
The Pompey era tour.
yeah, right.
Yeah, Pompey era's tour.
He stops in and he finds that the Maccabean kingdom is in the midst of a civil war, and both sides ask Rome for help. This is a bad sign. Never ask Rome for help in your civil war. Pompey goes, sure, and then makes Israel a client kingdom.
Ah, okay.
And then Mark Antony, right? He of Julius, also Octavian Caesar, and Cleopatra fame.
Yeah.
And Shakespeare. Mark Antony is kind of a disaster as a ruler, but one of the good things he does is he's a champion picker of delegates, And so he sets up in all these kingdoms that Pompey conquered eventually a series of client kings, among which is Herod the Great, who is this Arab tribesman, basically, that has a pseudo half claim to the throne that Mark Antony says you get the whole of Israelite territory, the whole kingdom, if you're a loyal client monarch to Rome. Herod says, sure, waltzes in and conquers the place. That's Herod the Great.
Okay.
Rules the whole of Israelite territory, basically. He dies, and Herod has a couple sons, and the Romans usually went from client monarch to a transition period to direct administration. Was kind of their way of conquering a place and ruling it.
So they had a long-term bureaucratic view of takeover.
Right, and so he dies, and he has 3 or 4 sons. I think it's 4, and they say, and Herod willed that the kingdom be split between them. They each get a portion. And the Romans say, well, hold on a minute. Because they all go, well, we all want to be kings. And the Romans go, nope. We're not calling you guys kings. Like, your dad had that right, but nobody else, no. So Herod's technical title is he is ethnarch or tetrarch, because there's 4 of them. So the kingdom gets split into 4 ways, with Jerusalem under direct Roman administration, which is why Pilate
Is there. Okay.
And there's a Roman legion stationed,
In
there. So Herod is king of Galilee, literally. Like, that's his territory, is the Galilee. He's ethnarch or tetrarch of Galilee. That's the long version of history for.
So that's why of the 4 brothers, he's the one the Bible focuses on in the New Testament.
Right, because Jesus is a citizen of Herod, technically.
Okay.
That's what that back and forth between Pilate and Herod is about Jesus, is they're trying to decide who has jurisdiction over him. Do you have him because Pilate literally says he's your race, like you're ethnarch, you're literally, this ethnicity is yours. He's Galilean, so is he, and Nazareth is his territory. So is he, because he's Nazarene, does that mean he's under Herod, or does that mean because his crime was in Jerusalem, does that mean it's under Pilate?
Yeah.
They finally settle on Pilate as the venue.
But even that, you said the crime is in Jerusalem, but he only ends ministry there. Most of the time, wouldn't he have been committing his crimes in Herod's
He's kind of all
territory?
over, he wandered into all 4 areas. There's a point at which, I think it's a little right soon after this, or right before it, where the Pharisees actually say to Jesus, you better get out of here, Herod wants to kill you. And Jesus goes, who cares about that fox? I don't care, But Jesus' charge is sedition and treason and violation of the Roman peace by occupying the temple. He's a disturber of the peace, which is a capital offense.
Now, occupying the temple sounds like he and the disciples took it over.
That's
But
kinda
did
what
he
happens.
really?
Well, it's kind of what happens if you read the Bible carefully,
Okay.
right? Like, the crowd marches in, and then it says they go up to the Temple Mount. And then if you read, there's this long series of disputes that it's like Occupy Wall Street, but Occupy the Temple, where it says Jesus is preaching and teaching in the temple. It's basically this crowd takes control of the Temple Mount area. And the Pharisees have to make him lose face or the Sadducees, not the Pharisees. The high priest and his party need to make Jesus lose face before they can arrest him. So they keep getting him in these series of controversies, hoping he'll answer the wrong way, so that then he'll lose credit with the crowd. And that's where you get the question about paying taxes, stuff like that. He's occupied the temple grounds, and they're trying to dislodge him,
All right. Now, what about with John? Pulling this back to
pulling
today's
this back
theme.
to John, right? Yeah.
John and Jesus, when supposedly, right, they're cousins.
Yeah.
So they've known each other for a while, even in the womb, right? John kicks when Mary's womb gets close to Elizabeth's womb.
Right.
And yet, when we move up to Jesus going up to see John and get baptized, it sounds like John didn't really know him. And then, of course, there's this whole thing of, it also sounds like Jesus then became a disciple of John And then after this beheading is when Jesus is like, okay, John's not here anymore. I'm kind of going to take over John's ministry.
Right.
So it sounds like Jesus was John's disciple for a while. And I'm trying to get that into the whole context.
Doesn't tell us if he's John's disciple or not. It tells us some of the other disciples are John's disciples.
Yeah.
And
But even to the point where it's like John
Andrew-
sends the disciples to find out what Jesus is doing, like they're suspicious of his activity.
Well, there is that episode where John is in prison and he says, "Are you the one, or are you the one the one who's promised, or should we wait for another?" I hear that as John is kind of sitting in prison waiting to be beheaded, and he's thinking, "This isn't how I thought this would go." Because I think John thinks as much as anybody else does that the Messiah is. Well, John's preaching, right, was, right? Even now, the axe lies at the root of the tree, and so John has got this, he's wondering, like, ain't no impinging hellfire and judgment, I'm here in prison, Herod is still king, Romans are still here, Sadducees are still in charge of the temple, right?
So it's like everything
dear
for
cousin
nothing.
Jesus, this is not what I thought was happening, isn't how I thought it would go. And Jesus' response is, well, go tell him, right? The blind see, the lame walk, the dead are raised,
Mm-hmm.
The deaf hear, and blessed is anyone who's not scandalized by my name, which is, trust me, it's happening. It's just not happening the way you thought it would,
Okay.
Um,
Or hitting the end of time.
Yeah.
The end of time,
The end of
being
time.
apocalyptic.
Right.
But one final question then, and this has bugged me. We've kind of skirted it before, but we've never really asked it directly. If they were cousins, and some of the child gospels even talk about them playing as kids together.
Those are heretical for us.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, again, hi,
Yeah.
heretic.
Yeah.
Why does their relationship as adults here at like the age of 30 seem like they don't know each other? Had Jesus gone off somewhere for a big chunk of time? And
Talk to the Hindus, they would say, yeah.
well, and that
Yeah.
brings all that up.
Yeah.
Because there are parallels.
Right.
But they act like they were strangers to each other.
Well, I don't know if they act like it or if we're just expecting characterization like we've talked about that the Bible's just
Not good at it.
not interested in doing, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure how it would show it short of doing like modern character analysis by going, when Jesus saw John, his heart, it's like,
Sorry, skip the beat. They
yeah,
hugged and
right,
yeah,
they hugged,
caught
and
up
it's
on
like-
old times.
right? And these are all things the Bible just does not care about, And so, I think part of it is just that the Bible is not interested in that level of interpersonal relationship with Jesus, and so, who knows, right? Who knows? I will say, not everybody knows all their cousins well,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Myself included, but
right, and who knows what happened, Elizabeth is in the Jerusalem area, obviously, because her husband's a priest, but, Mary and Joseph are way up in Nazareth, after they leave Bethlehem, so,
only see each other on high holy days.
right,
Yeah.
right. Do you only see John at Thanksgiving and, Super Bowl or whatever, like something like that, right? Like, not everybody's deep friends with their cousins.
Yeah.
So.
And just because we did say the short life of John at the very beginning, obviously it ends, well, not with the axe, because it sounds like he sent a soldier down with a sword to actually behead
Yeah,
him.
which is probably more merciful, actually. But
Phew.
swords were sharper, so,
Wow. So the axe is more of a blunt cut.
yeah.
Doesn't sound good either way.
The axe is relying on the weight of the weight of the down chop. The sword is relying on a soldier's sword is actually the most merciful way to go. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'll take some some hope in that.
Yeah.
So I guess he would have been, Jesus' ministry was 3 years.
Yeah.
So John would have died around the age of 30.
Yeah, probably.
So still way too young.
Yeah, he's a young man. That's a nasty story.
Man. All right, we'll end it there.
All right.
Here endeth the lesson.
Here endeth the lesson.
Cool. Off next week because we'll be service in the
outside.
park.
Yeah, service in the park. Everybody should join us. But
we'll be back in 2 weeks, and we'll leave with Steve's words about where Herod made his bet. Steve says that must have been one hell of a dance.
yes. Yeah, right. Well, yes. Right. Which is, again, why Herod is pretty foolish. It's like, over a dance, man? Like, you know.
Yeah, especially from your daughter.
Right. Over a dance, man? Come on. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
like,
I've watched Dancing with the Stars. Nobody's
that good.
that good.
Right. Right. So, all right.
All right. See you in 2 weeks, people.